Okay. John Michael's not here, Anna's not here, so you are the focus. What are you doing right now? And then for the rest of you, you all can think about that as well. What are you doing right now? I bet you you're doing things you're not even thinking about doing. Are you focused on breathing? Are you focused on pumping blood through your body? You focused on digesting your breakfast? Does your heart pump? And do your lungs breathe? Because you're thinking, okay, lungs, breathe. Heart, now give me a beat. Now lungs, breathe. No, they just do it, right? Okay, next question, Jonathan. Did you start them doing it? No, absolutely not. And this is the point. They do it because God made us. And that's how He made us. So they started because God started us, and they operate with us not even thinking about it because that's how God made us. Right? And then we're responsible for doing things like exercising, like trying to eat healthy, eating more good stuff than junk, which particularly during the pandemic was a difficult thing to do. But I bring this up not because we're going to be talking about our bodies today, but that's how we need to be thinking about the reading from 1 Peter. You see, when we think about what God has done for us, we don't live the way St. Peter tells us to live because that's what starts our relationship with God. God did that for us, right? We don't do this because this is what keeps us in relationship with God, because God does that for us. We do this because this is how we are to respond to what God has given us. And I always want to keep that in mind. It's so easy for us to think about, well, as Christians, this is what we do. And the other things that we're supposed to do, there's no doubt about that. But these things don't make us Christians. Doing what God calls us to do is a response to what He's done for us. And I don't want you to forget that. I don't want you to think that as we go through what 1 Peter says, that you're thinking, I need to do this in order to be a Christian. We're a Christian because we believe in Jesus. We're a Christian because we've trusted God. We do this because of who God is and what He's done for us. Right? Okay, with that, let's go to and look at what 1 Peter says. And my throat, not 1 Peter, said take a drink. So 1 Peter says, finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil, or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. And that's a really tall order. Which is why it's really important for us to understand that it is God who brought us to life. And that it is God who carries us through. Because if we think that if I fall short of this, somehow I'm going to lose my salvation, then we all ought to think, I've lost my salvation. Because we will not do this perfectly. Our hope, our trust, our rest, our faith is in God. I like to think of the movie Frankenstein. You know, it wasn't like the monster brought himself to life. It's not like we bring ourselves to spiritual life. God brings us to life. And God cares for us. And then this is how we respond. Our call is not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds, according to Romans 12. And that's really important for us because the very first thing he says at the finally, all of you, he says, be of one mind. And I am willing to stake the claim that if we were to put forth pretty much, pick any topic confronting our nation today, and poll everybody who is here with us and on Facebook or Zoom, and see if we agree on everything. And I'm willing to stake the claim that we don't. And we won't. That's not the point. See, the moment we do that is we've foregone the idea of being transformed by the renewing of our minds, and we've slipped into everybody else has to think like me. And that's the problem. We are to be seeking the mind of God. We are to be seeking His will. And that's the reality. And God makes us different. And God gives people different gifts. And if you ask people, what's the most important thing? Well, apart from the gospel, hopefully we can all agree on the gospel. But people would focus on different things. Somebody might say hospitality. The church has to be hospitable. And that would probably be because God gave them the gift of hospitality. And then somebody else would say, no, it's prayer. Come on, as Christians, we're supposed to be people of prayer. And that would be somebody who's given the gift of prayer. Of course, I would say, it's preaching. It's all about the sermon, right? Well, that's because I have an ego, but that's something else altogether. You know, we're given different gifts, and we would promote those because that's what God's given us to focus on. Now, again, all of this is submitted to the gospel. All of this has to be in the truth of who God is and what He's done. Apart from that, we have nothing. But in that, we are called to be of one mind. And that one mind is that we are seeking the will of God and to submit to the will of God, not seeking our own will or our own thoughts or our own minds on matters. And that's how we can be of one mind. Whether it is a very thorny political issue, or whether it's something as simple as, what's the best color for appliances? We're going to disagree. People will disagree on it, but if I am seeking to serve God rather than to get my way, and if you are seeking to serve God rather than to get your way, we can come to be of one mind on these issues. When Donald Trump was elected president, there were people who were so incensed, they said, I'm not going to pray for him by name. I thought, that's ludicrous. The one thing we should all be able to agree on is praying for our leaders. Whether we like them, don't like them, agree with them, don't agree with them, pray for them. We should be praying for those who have been elected to lead us and guide us. And that should be without controversy. The only way that can become controversial is because, well, I want my way. And I didn't get my way, and so I'm going to hold my breath until I do. And let me remind you that we elect presidents every 4 years, and you can't hold your breath that long. Pray for your leaders. Pray for the ones you like and pray for the ones you don't like. I have a fairly wide libertarian streak in me, so I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's way more that I don't like and don't agree with than the handful that I do like and do agree with. And if I held my breath until I got my way, well, sometime back in 1976 when I first got to vote would have been the last time I got to vote, because I would have expired from holding my breath. It's not about me getting my way. It's not about us getting politicians that we like. It's not about the matter of getting our will. It's a matter about submitting our will to God. It's about pointing people to God. It's about doing what God calls us to do. And if we can't even pray for these issues together, then how can we be unified in them? There will be all sorts of things that will confront our nation, all sorts of things that are confronting our nation, all sorts of things that have confronted us that we don't all agree on. But we can all pray for them. We can all pray for, and this is the really tricky part, God's will to be done. Not my will to be done. So being of one mind means being in prayer and seeking God's will for the world around us. It means being in prayer and seeking God's will for our congregation. We won't all agree on what's the best things that we ought to be doing. We'll all agree on, and hopefully we all agree on, that we ought to be doing something. But what's the best thing? What's the best way to reach our neighbors? We will disagree on that. But we ought to all agree on that we are called to reach our neighbors. And if we prayerfully come together to that end, we can be of one mind. One of the things that we will need to do is that we will need to submit our will to being supportive of things that we might not think be the best way. That's the reality of how things work. So as a congregation, we come together and we decide what we really want to focus on is do X. Like, I don't really think X is going to work. So we discuss it, and the congregation decides this is what we're going to go forward doing. Then do your best to make X work the best that it can. That's how we be of one mind. It's not about getting my way. It's about serving God and being united in that purpose. My last thought on being all of one mind is that one of the problems we have, and this is particularly pernicious in our culture today, we seem to want everybody to notice how wise we are on everything. The internet has its great advantages. One of the disadvantages is it gives people a platform to give their opinions on every bit of news just as it hits, like they have something to say about it. And when we do this, we end up pointing people to ourselves. Well, let me tell you what I think about that. And as Christians, we're not called to point people to ourselves. We're called to point people to Jesus. We're called to point people to God our Father, not to ourselves. My opinion on the state of the world isn't really all that important. What's more important for people to know is my dependence upon God, my desperate need for the Holy Spirit in our lives. So the first call is to all be of one mind, and that causes us to submit our will, our thoughts, our desires to God. And that we come together seeking God's will done in our lives, in our congregation, in our families, in our state, in our nation, and in the world. And we may disagree on what's the best way for things to be done, but we should agree on God knows the best way for things to be done. And we should be able to discuss our differences on these topics in a way that gives honor and glory to Him, that we are seeking Him. The second thing he says, being of one mind, having compassion for one another. Love as brothers. Having compassion, caring for one another. Love as brothers. My first thought of this is that maybe Peter made a mistake. Because my brother and I had a brother who was not quite 2 years older than me. We fought so much that my mom bought us boxing gloves so that he wouldn't hurt me. I mean, love as brothers. We fought every day. We fought over everything. I drove him crazy. My brother was very neat and organized before he went into the military, and the two words that will never be used to describe me are neat and organized. And we shared a bedroom. Love as brothers. What does that mean? Well, I will tell you what that means. Brothers are supposed to care for one another. That's the whole idea of compassion. And my older brother cared for me. My older brother did all sorts of things for me. Of that, there was absolutely no doubt. The love as brothers to care for one another. You know, people often ask the question, what, am I my brother's keeper? Well, you're quoting scripture there, but the guy who said that just murdered his brother. Maybe you want to re-examine using that. Yes, you are your brother's keeper. Yes, we are our brother's keeper. We are to be responsible for each other. We are to look out for each other. My brother helped me when I was in trouble. My brother had no problem telling me I was acting like a dope when I was acting like a dope. We are responsible for one another. We are to love as brothers. We are to have compassion. What does it mean to have compassion? It means to care and take action. It doesn't mean to say, well, that's really terrible. I feel bad for you. But my life is good, so I'm going to go on about things that make me feel happy, because talking to you makes me feel sad right now. Compassion means to take action for someone else. Which is why it's tied to love as brothers. Having compassion for one another. Love as brothers. Care for one another. Look after one another. Be responsible for one another. And then he says, be tender-hearted, be courteous. And courteous is something that is, well, lost today. And courteous is something that is very important. People will point out, well, you know, manners and cultural norms, they vary from culture to culture. And absolutely they do. So people say, well, you know, they do this here and they do that there, so it doesn't really matter what we do. Absolutely wrong. Yes, they do it differently in different cultures. But the whole idea of being courteous, the whole idea of politeness, is the idea of acting in a way that says others matter. It's not like there's some universal moral law about how you hold a fork or whether you even use a fork. The universal moral law is you act in a way that says you are aware that you're not the only person there. Remember when our short-term mission trip to Germany, Gerhard Meyer, who's now a bishop, would have us go to families that were people, Germans, who had been living behind the Iron Curtain, who were being repatriated back into Germany. And so we would go and have dinner with one of the local families that was being repatriated. And so I'm having dinner with this family that was from Russia. They were Germans originally, and they're being repatriated in. And I'm terrified because I don't like cabbage, I don't like beets. I know we're going to have borscht. You know, I'm like, oh, this is going to be horrible. Guess what? I like it. Apparently, it's the Irish way of cooking these things. I don't like it. The way everybody else cooks cabbage, I'm good with. I'm like, I must have been adopted. My whole family loves corned beef and cabbage. I'm like, it's the worst thing in the world. Everybody else cooks cabbage great. We do terrible things with it. But so I go to have dinner with this family, and so I watch to see what they're doing. And one of the things they do is they have this small bowl that has chunks of meat in it. So I'm like, I like meat. I don't know if I'm going to like this borscht, but I like meat. And the father of the family takes his fork and sticks it in a chunk of meat, pulls it out, and takes a bite off of it off his fork. Now that's not how we do it here. But I wasn't here. So what did I do? I watched what everybody else did, and I took my fork, I put it in, I grabbed a piece of meat, and I took a bite off of it. Because I am doing what they are doing, because I'm in their home, and what I'm saying is, I'm in your presence and you matter. So often today, we live in a world that all we think about is us. If you don't like the way I do it, that's too bad for you. And that's a horrible way to live. Being courteous means living in a way that shows that you are aware that you are around other people and they matter. Yes, it's done differently all over the world. There was an Ethiopian church that rented space from the church where I went in West Philadelphia when I lived there. And I would get invited to dinners at the Ethiopian church, and I loved it. Because first off, the food was very spicy. And secondly, they ate everything. You'd get this huge piece of sour bread. And man may not live by bread alone, but feed me a meal without it and see how well I do. I like my bread. And so they would have this huge piece of sour bread, which tasted so good, and you would break a piece of bread off, and you would scoop the stew up and put it in your mouth and eat it. This is great. It's great food. It's a wonderful way to eat it. I enjoy this. But I didn't eat my food like an American because I was with the Ethiopians. And I did it that way, not just because I thought it was wonderful and fun, though it certainly was, but because I wanted to do it like them because it says they matter. What Peter is telling us is to live in a way that says, the people around me matter. Manners change, customs change from culture to culture. But living in a way that shows people matter is a universal. It may be displayed in different ways. But that's what we're called to do. I would challenge you, certainly a challenge to me, to think about when you're driving, typical interstate driving in New Jersey, who are you thinking about matters at that point? I know my thought is that why is this car doing 60 and a 65? How can this person only be doing 50 on the highway? What are they here to block everybody? Aren't they thinking about anybody else? And of course, who am I thinking about? Me, because they're slowing me down. But to think and to act and to live in a way that says the people around me matter. The last thing that we want to look at is, he says, we should be willing to suffer. He says, and who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. We should be willing to suffer for the good of others. Jesus suffered for us. Jesus suffered for the good of others. Are we willing to suffer for the good of others? And ask yourself this, what are you willing to put up with to get what you want? What are you willing to put up with to get something you desire? Are you willing to do that for somebody else? One of the things that I'm not willing to do, that has always fascinated me that people do this, is that people will go stand in line forever on Thanksgiving to get at those Good Friday deals. Well, okay, if that's your thing, you do that. But then think of how many times we've had crowds go out of control because I want to be first in getting that Good Friday deal. Are you willing to let others go in front of you to get that? You know, we're willing to push to the front to get what we want, but are we willing to let others? What are we willing to do for others? Well, whatever we would do for us, we should be willing to do for someone else. Now, there are things that I will wait in line for. I hate crowds. I don't like being in crowds. I could do without it. I got to go to the new baseball stadium in Philadelphia right after it opened. I can tell you, there was an enormous crowd. By the time I got to my seat, I was wound up because you were just in a sea of people the whole time. But I got to be in a stadium when it just opened, and I was going to be there to see the Phillies play. If I would go through that for me, I should be willing to go through something like that for somebody else. When I was younger, I was not the sharpest tool in the box when it came to automobiles, and I would have a tendency to forget to check that F and E. You know, that little meter? And I would love to tell you that I ran out of gas once and I learned my lesson. But I'd be telling a fib. I don't know what it was, it just never dawned on me till the engine started to sputter that maybe I should have looked at that F and E and see where that meter was in between. And at one point, I was like 18 years old and I had a pickup truck, and there were multiple times I pushed that pickup truck by myself to a gas station that was like a mile down the road because I ran out of gas. You think, well, hopefully you get smarter. But more to the point is that I would stop when I saw other cars broke down and ask them if they needed help. And most of the time people would look at you like, why do you stop? You're making me nervous. But I figured if I'm pushing my car all the time, I ought to be willing to push somebody else's car if they need a hand. I mean, it's really just that simple. Be willing to suffer for others. Be willing to do for others. Be willing to give for others. We'd move heaven and earth if it stood in the way of our family. Are we willing to do that if it stands in the way of somebody else's family? Our call as the church is to be Jesus to the world. The church is the body of Christ. So in order to be Jesus to the world, we need to love in humility. We need to serve and be willing to suffer so that others will see Jesus through us. That's our call. Let us pray.